in a packed courtroom in a small southern town. My mother pointed directly at me. "She is a useless daughter," she declared. I did not argue or cry. I sat in absolute silence. Then, the judge flipped open a file. He looked at my parents' lawyer and asked a question that made the room freeze. "Do you really not know who she is?" That shock was just the beginning of exposing their forged signatures and hidden greed. "My name is Harper Campbell." The words struck the heavy, stifling air of the Red Clay County courthouse like a cracked whip. She is a useless daughter. My mother, Denise, stood a mere 20 feet away from me. Her index finger remained leveled directly at my chest, shaking with what I knew was a perfectly rehearsed display of maternal grief. She delivered the line with practiced precision, her voice trembling just enough to sell the heartbreak to the packed gallery behind us. This was exactly what they came for. The good citizens of Ashbriar, Tennessee, had packed the wooden pews to the very brim, hungry for the spectacle of a family tearing itself apart over dirt and inheritance. Ashbriar was the kind of place where a secret could not survive 24 hours, but a lie could be passed down for 3 generations. Today, my parents were banking on that exact cultural math. I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not flinch. A wave of reactive noise washed over the courtroom. The heavy oak benches groaned and creaked as dozens of bodies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A low, collective murmur rippled through the gallery, the sound of a small town actively judging one of its own. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw old Mr. Henderson, a man who had known my family for 4 decades, slowly shake his head in profound disappointment. He was looking at me. Naturally, in their eyes, I was the villain of this local tragedy. I was the ungrateful child who had turned her back on her blood. At the plaintiff's table, Todd Merrick, the high-priced attorney my parents had somehow secured, allowed a faint, self-satisfied smile to touch the corners of his mouth. He smoothed the lapels of his sharp navy suit, adjusting his posture to look like a champion of righteous family values. He thought he had the entire room eating out of the palm of his hand. He believed he had already won the psychological war, framing me as the cold, calculating prodigal child who only crawled back to rural Tennessee when the scent of money hit the wind. He was incredibly wrong. I maintained absolute silence. I stood perfectly still behind the battered wooden table assigned to the defense. My hands rested flat and steady upon a thick, matte gray folder. The texture of the cardstock grounded me against the oppressive heat of the room. I felt the steady, measured beat of my own heart against my ribs. I refused to offer them the satisfaction of a reaction. There would be no frantic defensive outbursts. There would be no desperate attempts to justify my absence over the past 9 years. I kept my gaze locked squarely on the elevated bench ahead of me, waiting for the performance to burn itself out. Judge Elias Boone peered down over the rim of his reading glasses. He was a man carved from the very bedrock of the county, known for his sharp intellect and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. He did not immediately gavel the room to order or leap to the defense of the accused. Instead, his sharp gray eyes settled heavily on me. I saw the slight furrow of his brow as he studied my posture. He was a veteran of probate and family disputes, and he had seen every variation of human greed and sorrow play out in this exact room. He expected tears. He expected shouting. He expected a broken, defensive underdog desperately trying to win back the affection of the room. What he saw instead was a woman who possessed a terrifying degree of calm. Todd Merrick cleared his throat, sensing the need to capitalize on the emotional momentum my mother had just generated. He stepped out from behind his table, pacing slowly across the scuffed linoleum floor, ensuring every person in the gallery had a clear view of his dramatic delivery. "Your Honor," Merrick began, his voice ringing with theatrical sorrow. "We are gathered here today to protect the legacy of a hard-working family from a daughter who abandoned them. Harper Campbell turned her back on her flesh and blood almost 10 years ago. She did not call. She did not visit when her grandmother fell ill. She contributed 0 hours to the care and maintenance of the estate. Yet, the very second the earth covers the coffin, she materializes in this county, demanding the keys to properties she never worked a single day to earn. She is entirely driven by greed, entirely absent of moral standing, and entirely useless to the people who actually stood by that dying woman's bed. Every word was designed to paint a masterpiece of guilt. My father, Ronald, sat beside his lawyer, nodding solemnly, playing the part of the exhausted, stoic patriarch who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. My mother dabbed her perfectly dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. The gallery practically hummed with righteous indignation on their behalf. They were painting a narrative so thick and compelling that facts seemed irrelevant. I did not move. I just kept my hand flat on the gray folder. Judge Boone did not acknowledge Merrick's impassioned speech. Instead, he reached out and opened the thick evidentiary binder I had personally submitted to the clerk the previous afternoon. The courtroom grew deathly quiet as the heavy silence of reading took over. The only sound in the vast room was the sharp rustle of thick paper turning, page after page. Boone's expression remained entirely unreadable, but the pace of his page turning began to slow down dramatically. He reached the middle section of the binder. He stopped. The silence in the room stretched out, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. 10 seconds passed. Then 20 seconds. Merrick stopped his confident pacing. Casting an uncertain, nervous glance toward the bench, my parents exchanged a deeply confused look. This was not the standard rhythm of a preliminary hearing. Judges did not pause speeches to read through appendices unless they found something entirely contradictory to the narrative being spun. Judge Boone leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy mahogany desk. He spent an unusually long time scrutinizing a specific document. From where I stood, I knew exactly which page held his attention. It was a document adorned with official professional verification stamps, accompanied by a dense, meticulously formatted spreadsheet of transaction reconciliations. It was cold, hard, indisputable math. It was the exact opposite of emotional manipulation. Slowly, the judge lifted his head. The atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted, dropping drastically in temperature. He bypassed the whispering gallery, bypassed my silently praying parents, and fixed a piercing, icy glare directly on the opposing counsel. "Counselor," Judge Boone said, his voice dropping into a register that commanded absolute, terrified obedience. "Before you spend another second attacking her character, did you read Exhibit 14 all the way through?" The question struck the room like a physical blow. Todd Merrick blinked rapidly, his polished, arrogant smile instantly vanishing from his face. He scrambled backward a half step. "Your Honor, I reviewed the preliminary filings regarding the trust. Yes, I focused entirely on the relevant testamentary claims and the medical declarations regarding capacity. I did not ask about your preliminary overview, Mr. Merrick." Boone fired back, his tone sharp enough to cut through solid steel. "I asked if you read Exhibit 14, the entirety of it." My father frowned deeply, leaning forward in his chair until the wood groaned. He glanced between the judge and his highly paid lawyer, entirely unable to comprehend the sudden, violent shift in the judicial weather. He whispered something urgent and angry to my mother. Denise Campbell froze completely. Her hand, still gripping the crumpled tissue, paused in midair. She lost her carefully constructed rhythm, the triumphant. Grieving mother routine evaporated from her face, replaced by a sudden, creeping realization that the narrative they had spent weeks building was sliding completely out of their control. Merrick stammered slightly, a massive crack finally appearing in his confident facade. He looked down at his own notes, suddenly realizing how thoroughly unprepared he was. "I am absolutely confident our petition addresses the core of the estate dispute, Your Honor." The character of the defendant is central to the issue of undue influence. Boone took off his reading glasses and set them down on the desk with a heavy, final clack that echoed off the high ceiling. He stared at Merrick with a mixture of professional disgust and genuine disbelief. Do you really not know who she is? The courtroom collectively stopped breathing. The utter shock in the judge's voice acted like a vacuum, sucking all the remaining air out of the room. I felt the eyes of every single person in the gallery snap forcefully toward me. They looked at my simple gray suit, my unmoving, rigid posture, and the gray folder resting beneath my calm palm. I kept my expression entirely blank, revealing absolutely nothing. But deep in my chest, a cold, calculated fire began to roar to life. My parents had walked into this courthouse today fully believing they were attending a simple, highly emotional hearing to snatch a dead woman's property away from an estranged, defenseless daughter. They thought their biggest weapon was public shame. They thought they could bully me out of town just like they did 9 years ago by turning the volume up on their lies. They had absolutely no idea what they had just walked into. Today was never about a house, a piece of land, or the hollow approval of the town of Ashbriar. Today would be the exact moment the truth about their desperate greed. The forged signatures on those banking documents and years of relentless, systematic silencing would finally be dragged kicking and screaming into the harsh, unforgiving light. The highway narrowed from 4 lanes down to 2, the asphalt growing rougher and more aggressively patched the deeper I drove into the rural belly of Tennessee. It had been almost 9 years since I last saw the county line of Ashbriar. The sky hung low and heavy, the color of bruised iron, threatening a late afternoon downpour that never seemed to break. The rusted green sign welcoming travelers to the town limits looked exactly the same as the day I left, perhaps bearing a few more dents from bored teenagers throwing rocks on Saturday nights. I gripped the steering wheel of my rental car, feeling the familiar, suffocating tension creeping up the back of my neck. I watched the landscape roll by, taking quiet inventory of the decay. The old Sinclair gas station still had the same peeling green dinosaur logo, though half the fluorescent bulbs in the canopy were dead. The farm supply store still had giant stacks of lime and fertilizer piled high against a rusted chain-link fence. The faces I passed on the cracked sidewalks had deeper lines, graying hair, and slightly more stooped shoulders. But the eyes remained exactly the same. They were sharp, deeply suspicious, and hungry for drama. Those eyes recognized the out-of-state license plates. Then, they recognized the woman sitting behind the glass in Ashbriar. I was never remembered as a success story who managed to escape a dead-end local economy. I was the stubborn, ungrateful child. I was the girl who packed a single canvas duffel bag at 19 years of age, standing on the front lawn screaming at her parents in front of God and all the neighbors. That fight was not a simple teenage rebellion. It was a desperate bid for survival. My parents had quietly drained the bank account holding my wages from 3 different summer jobs, claiming they needed the cash for household expenses while my father bought a newer truck. When I confronted them, they demanded absolute control over my life, my choices, and my money, framing their theft as the righteous cost of raising me. I swore that day I would never come back to this suffocating trap. I meant every single word. Yet, here I was. 3 days ago, my phone rang with an unknown local area code. It was not my mother or my father calling to deliver the news. It was the director of the local funeral home, a man who sounded exhausted by the mere act of breathing. My grandmother, Evelyn May Campbell, had passed away quietly in her sleep at 82 years old. The director informed me, in a hushed, apologetic tone that intentionally bypassed my parents entirely, that my name was explicitly listed as the primary contact and executor on a recently updated legal file. That phone call was the only reason I crossed the county line today. I did not come back to bathe in nostalgia or seek forgiveness from people who thrived on my absence. I came back because Evelyn was the only person in this town who ever made me feel safe. And clearly, She had left a door unlocked specifically for me. I pulled the car onto the crunching gravel driveway of her small single-story house at the end of Elm Street. The white paint was chipping aggressively around the wooden window frames, and the front porch sagged slightly on the left side. But the massive oak tree in the front yard stood as strong and protective as ever. I turned off the engine and sat in the absolute silence of the cabin for a long moment. I did not break down. I did not weep over the steering wheel or clutch a photograph to my chest. Instead, I reached into the passenger seat and grabbed my bags. I traveled strictly for a purpose. I had a small black suitcase containing exactly 3 days' worth of dark, practical clothes. Beside it sat a heavy-duty backpack holding a high-powered laptop, a portable document scanner, a bundle of secure encrypted drives, and a thick, lockable, zippered bag designed to protect physical files from moisture and tampering. I was not a grieving granddaughter returning to plan a potluck dinner and cry into a casserole. I was a professional stepping into a chaotic, unsecured environment, and my tools were packed accordingly. The town did not waste a single hour before the rumor mill roared to life. By the time I unlocked the front door of my grandmother's house and set my bags down in the dusty hallway, the telephone wires of Ash Briar were already humming with my name. I could practically feel the whispers filtering through the thin, peeling wallpaper. As I walked the 4 blocks down toward the center of town to get some caffeine, I felt the heavy weight of eyes tracking my movements from behind twitching curtains and screen doors. They were saying I came back to sell the land out from under my grieving parents. They were saying I came back to dig my greedy hands into whatever cash Evelyn had hidden under the mattress. Some even muttered that I caught wind of the new commercial development project moving through the county and wanted my unearned cut of the profits. Let them talk, I thought. Their assumptions were a perfect smokescreen. I needed coffee, and the Maple Spoon was the only place in town that brewed something stronger than dirty water. The rusty bell above the heavy glass door jingled a cheerful, tinny sound as I stepped inside. The diner smelled intensely of bacon grease, burnt dark roast, and decades of stagnant, circular conversation. The moment my foot crossed the faded linoleum threshold, the low, steady hum of morning chatter died. It did not fade gracefully into polite murmurs. It stopped dead, as if someone had pulled the main power switch on the entire building. Every single head in the diner turned on a swivel. The men sitting in the corner booths paused mid-bite, their forks hovering over plates of scrambled eggs. The older women sitting near the front window stopped stirring their sugar, their eyes locked on my back. It was a suffocating fishbowl. I felt the heavy, pressing weight of their collective judgment pressing against my chest. They saw the prodigal daughter, dressed in sharp city clothes, walking into their territory as if she owned it. I ignored every single one of them. I kept my chin level, walked straight to the long wooden counter, slid onto a cracked red vinyl stool, and looked directly at the young waitress wiping down the stainless steel prep area. "1 black coffee, please," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of warmth. I did not order food. I did not ask how her day was going. I sat perfectly still on the stool, resting my hands on the cool countertop, listening to the silence slowly break into furious, hushed whispers behind my back. I could hear snippets of sentences floating over the clatter of silverware. Words like audacity and shame drifted past my ears. They were dissecting my clothes, my rigid posture, and my perceived motives. I let them. I took the thick, steaming mug the waitress slid toward me and took a slow sip, staring straight ahead at my own reflection in the pie case mirror. Just as I set the heavy mug back down on the counter, I felt a bony, trembling hand tap the back of my shoulder. I turned around slowly. Standing right behind my stool was Martha, an elderly woman who had lived 3 houses down from my grandmother for the better part of 50 years. She leaned in uncomfortably close, her breath smelling strongly of peppermint and old medicine. Her eyes darted nervously around the dining room, ensuring no one was close enough to hear her. "You came back at exactly the right time," Martha whispered, her voice rough and dry like crushed autumn leaves. People have been talking about your grandmother's land for a whole month. Nolan Price operated out of a converted Victorian house just 2 streets off the main square. The structure leaned slightly to the left, tired from a century of foundational settling. He had sold off the bulk of his aggressive litigation practice over a decade ago, choosing to spend his twilight years managing the quiet, predictable work of wills, estates, and simple local conveyances. The air inside his office smelled faintly of dried lemon furniture polish and 50 years of accumulated paper dust. It was the scent of forgotten histories and quiet endings. I sat across from him in a cracked leather wingback chair. He was a kind man. His shoulders stooped beneath a worn tweed jacket, but he looked incredibly weary. He pushed a thick, expandable manila folder across the scratched mahogany surface of his desk. I opened the flap. I did not find a simple last will and testament. Evelyn was infinitely smarter and far more guarded than anyone in this whispering town ever gave her credit for. She had not left her estate to the mercy of the standard probate courts. Instead, she had established a revocable living trust several years prior. The moment her heart stopped beating, that trust had permanently locked, becoming irrevocable by law. I scanned the first page, my eyes locking onto the designated titles. I was not simply named as a beneficiary. I was the explicitly appointed successor trustee. This was not a minor detail. This single legal designation changed the entire battlefield. It meant I was not merely waiting in the wings for a judge to hand me a check. I held the fiduciary power. I held the legal keys to every single asset within that trust. If my parents thought they were walking into a straightforward fight over a house, they were catastrophically mistaken. I turned to the schedule of assets attached to the back of the trust document. The inventory listed the sagging white house and the 3 acres of overgrown grass on Elm Street. But right below that residential deed sat something entirely unexpected. It was a commercial property deed. Evelyn owned an old, corrugated steel warehouse sitting on the far eastern edge of the county line. For decades, that warehouse had been nothing more than a rusting, vacant shell where stray dogs slept and teenagers drank cheap beer on Friday nights. However, the economic landscape of the region was quietly shifting. Whispers had been bleeding out of the state capital for the better part of a year regarding a massive new commercial logistics route. The proposed state highway expansion was designed to bypass the heavily congested interstate, and the blueprints cut directly through the eastern edge of our county. If that highway project broke ground, that rusting, forgotten warehouse was suddenly sitting on the most valuable commercial footprint in the entire district. The property was appreciating in value by the hour. This was the true prize. Nolan cleared his throat softly. Drawing my attention away from the property schedules, he opened his top desk drawer and pulled out a small, sealed ivory envelope. "She asked me to give this to you directly," Nolan said, his tone carrying a heavy, solemn weight. "She was very specific. She wanted no copies made, and she wanted it handed to you in person." I took the envelope. The paper was thick and expensive, completely out of place in this dusty room. I slid my fingernail under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of matching stationery. The handwriting was frail, the blue ink pressing deeply and unevenly into the fibers of the paper. It was a short, incredibly deliberate message. "Do not let anyone turn your kindness into evidence against you." A cold chill radiated down my spine, settling deep in my chest. It was a warning from the grave. Evelyn knew exactly what kind of vultures were circling her bed in those final months. She knew my absence would be weaponized. I carefully folded the letter and tucked it into my jacket pocket. I shifted my focus back to the business at hand. I asked Nolan for the banking ledgers he had gathered for the final estate accounting. He obliged, handing over a thick stack of standard, monthly bank statements. I do not read financial statements the way normal people do. I am trained to look at numbers as a direct translation of human behavior. Every transaction tells a story of intent. I began scanning the debit columns covering the final 8 months of her life. The legitimate expenses were perfectly organized. The home health care agency was paid promptly via certified bank checks. The local pharmacy was paid via automatic direct debit. The utility bills were consistent, but interwoven between those necessary. Documented expenses was a parasitic drain. I traced my finger down the margins. There was a withdrawal of $500 on a Tuesday afternoon, a withdrawal of $200 the following Monday, then $300 a week later. They were small, steady, relentless cash bleeds. There were absolutely zero receipts, invoices, or corresponding deposits to justify these transactions. A dying woman confined to a bed, receiving round-the-clock care from a paid nurse, does not have a sudden, urgent need for a constant supply of $20 bills. The money was being quietly and systematically siphoned. I continued flipping through the disorganized correspondence file Nolan had kept separate from the formal trust documents. Near the very back, a single sheet of paper caught my eye. It was a photocopy of a durable power of attorney form. It was poorly aligned on the glass, the edges shadowed and skewed. The document was largely incomplete, lacking the necessary notary stamps and witness signatures. But the primary authorization line bore my grandmother's name. I pulled the paper closer to the brass desk lamp, leaning in to examine the ink strokes. Evelyn had developed a noticeable tremor in her hands during her final years, a symptom of her failing nervous system. But the signature on this page was fundamentally wrong, unnatural. Age-related tremor is chaotic but fluid. The pen never truly stops moving. It just wavers off course. The jagged edges of this specific signature were entirely stiff. I could see distinct hesitation marks. I could see the tiny, dark pooling of ink that only happens when someone stops the pen entirely, looking at a reference, and then deliberately continues tracing a shape. It was not a signature. It was a drawing of a signature. It was an unfinished practice run left carelessly in a stack of old mail. I did not gasp. I did not slam my fist on the desk or scream accusations of fraud. Doing so would only alert the enemy that I had found their tracks. I remained perfectly calm, my expression locked in a neutral, professional mask. I unzipped my heavy-duty backpack and pulled out my portable document scanner. I connected the device to my laptop and asked Nolan for permission to digitize the entire file for my personal records. He nodded, leaning back in his chair, looking slightly bewildered by my cold, mechanical efficiency. The machine whirred quietly, feeding page after page into my encrypted hard drive. I was no longer just an heir. I was building a timeline. I was mapping the cash withdrawals against the dates of the home care visits. I was logging the date printed on that photocopied forgery. I was constructing a cage of undeniable data. Once the final page cleared the scanner, I neatly restacked the physical documents, packed my equipment, and zipped my bag closed. I stood up and offered Nolan my hand, thanking him for his diligence and his time. He walked me toward the heavy oak door of his office. He reached out and rested his wrinkled hand on the brass knob, but he did not turn it immediately. He stopped, looking at me with an expression of deep, profound unease. "Harper," Nolan said, his voice dropping into a raspy, strained whisper. "Your parents came into this office 2 times before the funeral was even over. They asked more about the commercial land than they did about her." I had not even managed to take my jacket off when the sound of heavy, aggressive tires crushing the gravel in the driveway echoed through the thin walls of the living room. The heavy slam of 2 car doors followed immediately after, vibrating through the floorboards. I stood perfectly still in the center of the faded floral rug, watching the brass doorknob turn. They did not knock. They did not wait for an invitation to cross the threshold of a house that no longer belonged to them. My father, Ronald, walked in first. He was a large man who carried his physical presence like a blunt instrument, his heavy work boots tracking gray dust onto the hardwood. My mother, Denise, followed close behind him, her posture rigid and her jaw set so tightly I could see the muscles twitching beneath her skin. 9 years had passed since I last stood in the same room with them. There was no hesitation, no shock of recognition, and absolutely no pretense of a polite family reunion. They did not ask how my drive was. They did not ask about my life. They brought the war directly into the house. "You have an incredible amount of nerve showing your face in this town," Denise said. Her voice was sharp and entirely devoid of maternal warmth. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, scanning the small living room as if looking for items I might have already stolen. "You disappear for nearly a decade? You do not call. You do not lift a single finger to help us when she got sick. And the second there is property on the table, you suddenly remember your way back to Tennessee." I did not raise my voice to meet hers. I kept my breathing even and my hands resting loosely at my sides. "Hello, Mother. Hello, Father." Ronald stepped forward, his face flushed with a dark, simmering anger. He pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at my face. "Do not play cold with us, Harper. We know exactly what you are doing. You think you can just waltz in here and take control of assets that are appreciating in value. We were the ones who stayed. We were the ones who checked on her. You abandoned this family, and now you want to cash in on the warehouse and the land." I looked at him, absorbing the precise vocabulary he chose to use. "Evelyn arranged her affairs exactly the way she wanted them," I replied, keeping my tone strictly factual, leaving no room for emotional debate. "The legal documents are exceptionally clear. I am here to execute her final wishes, nothing more and nothing less. Her final wishes were manipulated by a girl who knows how to work a system." Ronald snapped back, taking another aggressive step forward. The air in the room grew heavy and suffocating. He decided it was time to deploy his favorite weapon: the heavy burden of financial guilt. "You have absolutely no idea what we have been dealing with. We are drowning in out-of-pocket medical debts from her care. My property taxes jumped up 30% this year. I had to take out a massive, high-interest loan just to fix the transmission on the heavy-duty work truck so I could keep a roof over our heads. We carried the financial and physical burden of this family. That estate is meant to cover the obligations you ran away from." He was framing their personal financial mismanagement as a debt I somehow owed them. It was a classic tactic, designed to make me fold under the sheer weight of filial obligation. Denise immediately stepped in to reinforce his attack, shifting the angle from money to morality. "The one who stays is the one who has the right," she declared, her eyes burning with a righteous, terrifying certainty. "That is how the world actually works. Harper, you do not get to claim the reward when you refuse to do the hard work. A piece of paper does not erase your failure as a daughter. Your grandmother was old, she was confused, and she clearly did not understand the true value of what she was signing away to a stranger." I did not argue with her twisted logic. I did not bother explaining that I had been sending Evelyn money every single month for years, carefully routed through a separate account they never knew about. Instead, my mind began to dissect their words with cold, professional precision. Ronald had specifically mentioned the warehouse. He had specifically mentioned the phrase appreciating in value. Denise had mentioned Evelyn signing things away. These were not the casual observations of grieving children. To know the warehouse was appreciating meant they already knew about the proposed commercial highway project. To know I was in control meant they understood the mechanics of the revocable trust. They possessed highly specific, legally complex information about assets that Evelyn had deliberately kept hidden from them. Ordinary people in Ashbriar did not use terms like appreciating assets unless they had been asking very pointed questions. Or worse, making premature deals with outside developers. They were exposing their own playbook simply by opening their mouths. "The trust dictates the path forward," I said, quietly, refusing to give them the emotional explosion they were desperately trying to provoke. "If you have a problem with the legality of her decisions, you know where the courthouse is." Ronald glared at me for a long, heavy moment, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He realized I was not going to scream, cry, or apologize. I was a stone wall. He turned on his heel, grabbed the front doorknob, and yanked the door open. "You are going to regret this," he muttered. Before storming out, Denise shot me one final, venomous look before following him, letting the door slam shut with a violent crack that rattled the front windows. I was entirely correct about the courthouse. Exactly 3 days later, the trap was officially sprung. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, drinking a glass of water, when a heavy knock rattled the front door. I opened it to find a young, nervous-looking process server standing on the porch. He handed me a thick, yellow manila envelope, mumbled a quick confirmation of my identity, and practically ran back to his car. I took the envelope to the kitchen table, broke the seal, and slid the heavy stack of legal filings onto the wood. It was a formal civil petition. Ronald and Denise Campbell were officially suing to invalidate the final amendments of the trust and the will. I flipped through the densely typed pages, scanning the allegations. The claims were entirely predictable but highly damaging in a local court. They accused me of undue influence. They claimed Evelyn was suffering from severely diminished mental capacity during the final 2 years of her life. They were asking a judge to freeze all assets, strip me of my fiduciary powers, and hand total control of the estate over to them. I checked the signature line at the bottom of the petition. The representing attorney was Todd Merrick. I knew the name from my brief research into the local legal landscape. Todd Merrick was the most expensive and ruthless property litigator in the county. He did not win cases by debating the finer points of trust law. He won cases by destroying character. He was a master at turning the courtroom into a moral theater, painting his clients as hard-working, salt-of-the-earth victims and his opponents as greedy, out-of-town predators. Hiring him meant my parents were not just trying to take the property. They were trying to destroy me publicly in front of the entire town. I continued flipping through the heavy stack of documents, moving past the formal complaints and diving into the attached evidentiary exhibits. My parents had to submit some form of preliminary proof to justify the freezing of the estate. I turned to Exhibit B, and my hand suddenly stopped moving. I stared at the page, the blood slowly turning to ice in my veins. It was a photocopy of a durable power of attorney. It was the exact same form I had seen sitting in Nolan Price's dusty office file just days ago. But this version was fundamentally different. The incomplete, practice version I had scanned was gone. The document staring back at me now was entirely filled out. It possessed a bright, official-looking notary stamp. It bore the signatures of 2 witnesses I did not recognize, and on the primary authorization line, granting full financial control to my father, was Evelyn's signature. I pulled my portable scanner from my bag, booted up my laptop, and pulled up the digital copy of the incomplete forgery I had secured from the lawyer. I placed the new, completed document right next to the screen. I leaned in closely, my eyes tracing the loops and angles of the blue ink. The signature on the court filing was significantly better. The hesitations were smoother, the flow slightly more natural. Whoever drew this had spent a lot of time practicing since the first draft, but to a trained financial analyst who spent her life hunting discrepancies, a lie is always a lie. The pressure points were wrong. The angle of the final letter dragged downward instead of sweeping up. It was desperation, plain and simple. My parents had not just filed a frivolous lawsuit to steal a house. They had submitted a completely fabricated, forged legal document into the official county court record. They had just crossed the line from a bitter family dispute directly into a felony. The residents of Ashbriar believed I was a runaway who had failed at life, returning only because I had nowhere else to go. I never bothered to correct them. I never told anyone in this town that I was a senior financial trace analyst at Meridian Ledger Integrity Group. For the past 7 years, my daily professional life consisted of unraveling complex corporate embezzlement. tracking obscured financial transactions across international borders, and building airtight evidentiary files for civil litigation. I hunted lies for a living. My parents had just handed me a masterpiece of fraud, and I was going to dismantle it piece by piece. I did not retaliate with screaming matches or tearful phone calls. Anger is a remarkably inefficient emotion. Instead, I transformed my grandmother's faded dining room into a forensic workspace. I cleared the floral centerpieces and laid out my laptop, my portable scanner, and a massive roll of butcher paper. Over the course of 48 hours, I meticulously constructed a 12-month timeline of Evelyn's final year. I did not rely on memories or accusations. I relied entirely on data. I cross-referenced pharmacy receipts, utility bills, text message logs, grocery delivery schedules, and the banking statements I had secured from her attorney. The discrepancies I had noticed earlier began to form a highly specific, undeniable pattern. Those small, consistent cash withdrawals labeled as supplemental care payments were not going to the registered nursing agency. Through a basic routing number trace, I discovered the checks were being deposited into a regional credit union account. That account was registered to a small, obscure, limited liability company, which listed my father as the sole managing director. He was systematically bleeding her liquid assets under the guise of paying for her comfort. But the stolen cash was merely a symptom of a much larger disease. While sorting through a plastic storage bin of misfiled mail at the bottom of Evelyn's closet, I found the ultimate prize. It was a poorly hidden preliminary deposit contract drafted by a firm called Pine Meridian Logistics. It was a formal agreement to initiate the sale of the commercial warehouse property. The signature at the bottom did not belong to my grandmother. The contract was signed by my father, explicitly noting his capacity as the authorized representative under a durable power of attorney. The problem was that the date printed on the preliminary contract was executed 6 months before my grandmother actually passed away, long before the property legally belonged to anyone but her. I knew I could not simply walk into a courtroom and shout about a fake contract. The legal system demands verified chains of custody. I needed to destroy the foundational document giving him that power. I requested a formal confirmation of the notary stamp present on the completed power of attorney my parents had submitted to the court. I then pulled Evelyn's medical transport logs and clinical check-in receipts. The timeline was physically impossible. On the exact afternoon, the notary purportedly witnessed Evelyn signing away her financial independence in a downtown office. My grandmother was actively receiving a 4-hour intravenous treatment at the county pulmonary clinic. I had the clinic's time-stamped billing invoice to prove she was 3 towns away. To fortify the paper trail, I needed human corroboration. I tracked down the part-time registered nurse who had managed Evelyn's afternoon medications. We met at a quiet park on the edge of town. She was hesitant at first, looking over her shoulder, fully aware of the social politics of Ash Briar. She was perfectly sharp until the very end, the nurse told me. Her voice hushed. Evelyn knew exactly what day it was and exactly who was in the room, but she was exhausted, and she was terrified. She told me your father kept bringing heavy stacks of paper about the commercial land. She said he would try to force her to sign them while she was heavily medicated, telling her it was just for the hospital billing. The final piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly. Martha, the elderly neighbor who had spoken to me at the diner, knocked softly on my back door late one evening. She did not offer gossip this time. She offered a small silver flash drive. I installed a security camera on my side porch 2 years ago because kids kept stealing my potted plants, Martha said, pressing the drive into my palm. It points directly at your grandmother's front driveway. I think you should look at the motion captures from November. I plugged the drive into my laptop. The video files were crystal clear. I watched silent, high-definition footage of my parents arriving at the house multiple times a week during the exact period Evelyn's health took its sharpest decline. In every single video, my father was carrying thick manila folders and a heavy leather briefcase. They never stayed long. They were not there to comfort a dying woman. They were there to conduct hostile negotiations against a bedridden target. I spent the entire night before the preliminary hearing assembling the trap. The truth is utterly useless if it is poorly presented. A judge will dismiss the most righteous claim if it is buried in a disorganized pile of paper. I organized everything into a thick, matte gray folder. I printed clean, high-resolution copies. I tabbed every section. I numbered every exhibit from 1 to 20. I created a master index that cross-referenced the medical logs directly to the forged notary dates. It was an airtight, devastatingly simple narrative of elder abuse and civil fraud, engineered to hit that courtroom with devastating force the following afternoon. The sky over Ashbriar was gray and thick with humidity. I walked up the wide concrete steps of the Red Clay County Courthouse, holding the gray binder tightly against my side. I was 30 minutes early, precisely as planned, before I could reach the heavy brass doors. Todd Merrick stepped out from behind a large stone pillar. He was wearing his signature tailored suit, but the arrogant, relaxed posture I expected to see was entirely missing. He looked tense, glancing quickly around the courtyard to ensure no one was within listening distance. "Miss Campbell," Merrick said, stepping directly into my path to block my entry. "I think we should have a brief, off-the-record conversation before we walk into that room and cause irreparable damage to your family." I stopped, looking at him with absolute blankness. "I have nothing to say to you off the record, Mr. Merrick." He lowered his voice, dropping the theatrical lawyer persona entirely. "Your parents are willing to offer a generous, immediate settlement if you agree to quietly transfer the commercial warehouse property to their holding company today. They will drop the lawsuit regarding the residential house entirely. You keep the home, the liquid cash in the trust, and you walk away free and clear. No trial, no public spectacle." I stared at him. He was a shark. But right now, he was a shark trying to negotiate his way out of a net. They were offering me the house to buy my silence. I realized in that exact second that Todd Merrick did not know the full extent of the forgery. Or worse, he suspected it and was desperately trying to prevent a judge from looking closely at the documents his clients had provided. They were not trying to win a property dispute anymore. They were terrified of something significantly larger. They were terrified of prison. "No deal," I said softly, stepping neatly around him. I pulled open the heavy courthouse door and walked inside, ready to let the paperwork do the talking. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4 swung shut behind me, sealing off the humid outside air and locking me inside a pressure cooker of local gossip. The gallery was absolutely packed. Every single wooden pew was filled shoulder to shoulder with the residents of Ashbriar. People who had not spoken to my family in over 10 years were suddenly deeply invested in the proceedings. They were not there because they possessed a burning passion for the nuances of probate law or testamentary capacity. They were there because a family tearing itself apart over land and money was the greatest form of free entertainment this county had to offer. I walked down the center aisle, feeling the intense, collective stare of 50 people burning into my back. I took my seat at the defense table. I had elected to represent myself. A lawyer would only get in the way of the specific trap I had built. Todd Merrick stood at the plaintiff table, looking out over the crowd like a seasoned stage actor surveying his audience, when Judge Elias Boone called the court to order. Merrick did not waste a single second. He immediately launched into a highly calculated emotional strategy. He was a master of framing the narrative before a single piece of evidence was ever introduced. "Your Honor," Merrick began, his voice projecting a perfect blend of professional authority and deep sympathy. "We are here today to rectify a profound moral and legal injustice. You see before you Ronald and Denise Campbell. These are hardworking, salt-of-the-earth citizens who have spent their entire lives pouring their sweat into this community. They spent the last 5 years watching a beloved mother slowly slip away into illness. And who was there to shoulder that crushing burden they were? But where was the defendant? Merrick turned slowly, extending a dramatic hand in my direction. He used my absolute silence, my rigid posture, and my lack of visible emotion as a weapon. She was gone, he declared, letting the word hang in the quiet room. For nearly 9 years, the defendant vanished. She did not call on holidays. She did not offer a single hour of physical help when her grandmother could no longer walk up the front stairs. She lived a comfortable, detached life far away from the grueling reality of elder care. Yet, by some miraculous coincidence, the very moment the estate assets begin to appreciate in value due to commercial zoning rumors, she suddenly reappears. She expects this court to believe that a dying, confused, elderly woman, isolated and vulnerable, spontaneously decided to disinherit her primary caregivers in favor of a ghost. It was a brilliant opening statement. He successfully painted my quiet composure as cold, calculating apathy. The gallery murmured in loud agreement. I heard a woman in the second row whisper something about how I did not even have the decency to wear black. My father was the first to take the witness stand. Ronald wore his best gray suit, though it fit him poorly across the shoulders, making him look like a tired, beaten-down working man. Under Merrick's gentle questioning, my father began to construct a fortress of moral entitlement. I was the one who fixed the roof when it started leaking 3 winters ago. Ronald testified, gripping the edges of the wooden witness box. I was the one who drove her to the pulmonary clinic every single Tuesday and Thursday. I managed the lawn. I managed the plumbing. I spent thousands of dollars out of my own pocket just to make sure she was comfortable. We carried the entire weight of her decline. I did it because she was my mother, and it was the right thing to do. But it broke us financially. We took on massive debt just to keep her house warm. He was lying by omission, conveniently leaving out the part where he systematically drained her accounts to reimburse himself, but he delivered the lines with a raw, believable exhaustion. He made himself the ultimate martyr. Next came my mother. Denise stepped up to the stand, her hands clutching a white tissue. Her strategy was entirely different. While my father focused on his physical labor, my mother focused entirely on assassinating my character. She needed the judge to believe I was fundamentally unworthy of the trust. "Why did your daughter leave home 9 years ago?" Merrick asked gently. "Because she refused to do any serious work?" Denise answered, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. She always thought she was better than everyone else in this town. She thought she was too smart, too important to pitch in and help her own family survive. We asked her to contribute to the household, to be a part of the team, and she packed a bag and threw us away. She has no concept of loyalty. She has no concept of family. She only understands taking what she wants and leaving the mess for someone else to clean up. It was a devastatingly effective 1-2 punch. They had established themselves as the weary, exploited victims and firmly established me as the arrogant, lazy predator. When it was my turn to cross-examine them, I stood up from my table. The entire courtroom leaned forward, expecting me to shout, to cry, or to hurl vicious insults back at my parents. I did none of those things. I simply stated I had no questions for the witnesses at this time. The crowd let out a collective, disappointed sigh. They thought I was surrendering. They thought Merrick had broken me in the first hour. Judge Boone looked down at me, his gray eyebrows furrowing slightly. "Miss Campbell, you are representing yourself in a highly complex probate dispute. The plaintiffs have painted a very specific picture of your absence and your grandmother's vulnerability. Do you intend to offer any rebuttal? Or are you simply going to sit there?" "I have a brief statement and a submission of evidence, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of the emotional static that filled the room. "Proceed," Boone said, crossing his arms. "The plaintiffs have testified extensively about my physical absence," I began, looking directly at the judge and ignoring Merrick completely. "They have equated geographic distance with a lack of care. I am not going to argue about family dynamics or childhood grievances. This court operates on facts, not feelings. I have documented proof of continuous weekly communication with Evelyn May Campbell spanning the last 7 years. More importantly, I have a complete, verified ledger of direct financial support provided to her, specifically allocated for her medical and home care needs, which I routed through an independent trust account to ensure she had resources the plaintiffs could not access. I picked up the thick, matte gray binder from my table. I walked over to the clerk and handed it over. Todd Merrick let out a short, dismissive laugh from his table. He leaned back in his leather chair, looking entirely unbothered. Your Honor, a few $20 bills mailed in a birthday card and a couple of phone calls do not negate years of total abandonment. The defendant is trying to throw loose change at a structural wall of evidence regarding undue influence. It does not change the core reality of who was actually there. The crowd behind me began to shift and murmur again, clearly siding with the expensive lawyer. My mother, sitting at the plaintiff table, turned around to face me. The mask of the grieving mother slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the bitter, victorious sneer underneath. She thought they had won. She thought the town was on her side. The lawyer had done his job, and I was just a foolish girl holding a useless stack of paper. She is a useless daughter, Denise said, her voice carrying sharply across the room, loud enough for the judge to hear, loud enough for the entire gallery to witness my ultimate humiliation. Right at that exact second, Judge Boone flipped past the index of my gray binder and landed on the first major exhibit. The courtroom was still buzzing with my mother's cruel declaration, but the atmosphere at the bench instantly plummeted to freezing. The judge stopped moving. His eyes, previously relaxed and observant, suddenly locked onto the page with an intense, terrifying focus. He did not look at my mother. He did not look at me. He stared at the densely formatted financial reconciliations and the official professional verification stamps I had placed on the very top. The narrative of the runaway child shattered completely, replaced by a reality they never saw coming. Judge Boone did not slam his wooden gavel. He did not raise his voice to cut through the lingering, toxic echo of my mother's cruel insult. True judicial power in a courtroom does not require overwhelming volume. It requires absolute, surgical precision. He slowly closed the heavy, matte gray cover of my evidentiary binder, resting both of his hands flat against the thick cardstock. The oppressive heat of the room seemed to evaporate instantly, replaced by a sudden chilling draft of anticipation. He deliberately removed his reading glasses, completely ignoring my mother's dramatic, tearful posture, and locked his steely gaze entirely on the man who had orchestrated this theatrical display. Counselor, Judge Boone said. His voice was perfectly level, yet it carried a sharp, metallic edge that cut straight through the heavy air and reached the very back row of the gallery. Did you read Exhibit 14, 15, and 16 all the way through before you decided to attack her character? Todd Merrick froze in place. The arrogant, relaxed lean of his posture vanished in a fraction of a second. He pushed himself up from the heavy oak plaintiff table, suddenly looking incredibly small and entirely out of his depth in his expensive, tailored navy suit. He cleared his throat, producing a nervous, dry sound that amplified in the quiet room. Your Honor, Merrick started, his voice lacking its previous booming resonance. I reviewed the preliminary filings regarding the trust structure and the medical declarations of the deceased. My focus was entirely on the testamentary elements of the estate, not the defendant's personal or professional background. Her employment history in the city is entirely irrelevant to the timeline of her grandmother's physical and mental decline here in Ashbriar. Is it? Boone asked, leaning slightly forward over the heavy mahogany bench. The silence in the room became agonizingly tight, stretching like a wire about to snap under immense pressure. When a plaintiff stands in my courtroom and bases their entire civil petition on the fundamental argument of character and credibility, The background of the person they are actively attacking becomes profoundly relevant. You spent the last 45 minutes painting this woman as an absent, irresponsible child who lacks the basic competence and moral standing to manage a simple living trust. The judge picked up the thick gray binder and held it up slightly so the entire room could see the dense stack of meticulously tabbed pages. For the record, Boone continued, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority that commanded total submission from every person present. Harper Campbell is not an uneducated runaway looking for a quick, unearned payout. She is a senior financial trace analyst. She holds advanced, specialized certifications in tracking corporate cash flows, securing financial evidence, and conducting complex civil fraud analysis. Her daily profession is hunting down hidden, illicit money and building airtight evidentiary files for complex civil and federal litigation. A collective. Physical shockwave ripped through the solid wooden pews behind me. The sound of 50 people sharply inhaling all at once sounded like a sudden, violent gust of wind tearing through a dry forest. Boone did not allow the ambient noise to settle. He opened the binder again, turning with deliberate slowness to the middle section of the exhibits. The documents submitted in this defense file are not a random collection of disorganized bank statements downloaded from a public internet portal. These are transaction reconciliation tables formulated to the exact, rigorous standards of a forensic financial audit. They contain a documented, unbroken chain of custody. Every single wire transfer, every automated cash withdrawal, and every care-related medical invoice has been mapped, cross-referenced, and digitally verified against time-stamped geographical data. The evidentiary weight of the analysis sitting on my desk right now is significantly heavier and far more robust than anything your clients have provided to this court today. I turned my head just a fraction of an inch to look directly at the plaintiff's table. My mother was staring up at the judge with her mouth slightly open, the blood completely draining from her cheeks until her face matched the color of the cheap white tissue crumpled in her fist. For 9 long years, she had spun a comfortable, condescending lie to the ladies at the local grocery store and the women in her Sunday knitting circle. She had told everyone in Ashbriar that I was barely scraping by, doing random, meaningless office work in a crowded city because I fundamentally lacked the discipline to achieve anything real. That specific lie had been her armor against the profound embarrassment of my departure. It was how she maintained her status as the long-suffering, superior parent. Now, that armor was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces on the permanent public record. My father was entirely mute. Ronald Campbell stared blankly at the polished wood of his own table, his broad shoulders suddenly sagging inward. The sheer magnitude of his own ignorance was visibly crushing the breath out of his lungs. He had spent his entire adult life demanding absolute authority and control over everything under his roof, yet he truly had absolutely no idea who his daughter had become. He brought a sledgehammer to a delicate fight, only to discover his opponent was holding a surgical scalpel. Merrick stammered, frantically flipping through his own severely inadequate legal pad, searching for a lifeline that did not exist. Your Honor, professional credentials, no matter how impressive, do not automatically validate the narrative she is trying to present regarding the estate's distribution. The core issue of who was physically present for the deceased during her final months remains our primary, foundational focus. Mr. Merrick, your primary focus is currently standing on a bridge constructed of wet paper. Boone interrupted, his tone laced with zero tolerance for further legal maneuvering. He was not ruling out of blind emotion or sudden favoritism. He was a creature of the law, and the law had just been handed exactly the evidence it needed. You brought a highly sensationalized narrative into this room, designed specifically to frame a useless daughter. I am officially noting for the formal record that the picture your clients have painted today is severely lacking in factual integrity. You have aggressively attacked her capacity to govern this estate, but her capacity is exactly what produced this devastating timeline. I did not smile. I did not turn around to gloat at the packed gallery. I simply sat there, my hands resting loosely on the table, letting the heavy, suffocating silence do the devastating work for me. The entire energy in the courtroom had violently inverted. The residents of Ashbriar, the people who had walked through those doors expecting to watch a righteous execution of a greedy child, were suddenly shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The whispered insults from the back rows ceased entirely. I could hear the faint, nervous scuffing of shoes against the linoleum floor. Old Mr. Henderson, the man who had shaken his head at me in disgust just an hour ago, was now staring at my father with a deeply narrowed, suspicious gaze. They were looking at each other with wide, uncertain eyes. The harsh, undeniable reality was finally setting in. They had eagerly swallowed a one-sided, emotionally manipulated story fed to them by a bitter couple. And now they were trapped in the room while the cold, hard truth systematically dismantled it piece by piece. Judge Boone closed the gray binder for the final time. He looked down at my parents, his expression completely devoid of any remaining judicial patience. The theatrical, emotionally driven portion of the afternoon was officially over. Now came the brutal machinery of the law. "This court will take a 10-minute recess," Boone announced, his voice echoing loudly off the high plaster ceilings. "When we return, I will not be listening to any more speeches about family obligations, unpaid labor, or childhood grievances. When I come back to this bench, Mr. Merrick, we are going to look very, very closely at the legal authenticity of the durable power of attorney your clients submitted, alongside the pattern of cash withdrawals logged in Exhibit 16. He stood up, his heavy black robe sweeping aggressively against the wood of his desk. "Court is in recess." The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind the judge, plunging the courtroom into a sudden, chaotic recess. The gallery was no longer a unified, righteous mob eager to watch a runaway child get her comeuppance. It had instantly fractured into a room of deeply uncomfortable, whispering individuals. The collective realization that they had been rooting for the wrong side hung in the humid air like a thick fog. I remained perfectly still at the defense table, keeping my eyes cast downward on the gray folder. I did not need to turn around to feel the shifting tide. A shadow fell across my table. I looked up to see old Mr. Henderson leaning heavily against his wooden cane, accompanied by a woman I remembered from the local church choir. They did not offer a sweeping apology or an emotional speech. Mr. Henderson simply met my eyes, gave a slow, deliberate nod of his head, and shuffled away toward the heavy double doors to get some air in the hallway. In the rigid social currency of Ashbriar, a silent nod from a town elder was the absolute equivalent of a public retraction. The town was quietly stepping away from my parents. Across the aisle, the plaintiff table was a portrait of silent, contained panic. Todd Merrick was leaning in so aggressively that his nose almost touched my father's ear. The polished, theatrical champion of family values was completely gone. His face was deeply flushed, and his hands moved in tight. Frustrated, erratic gestures. He was furiously whispering at Ronald, demanding to know exactly what else was buried in the financial history. Finally realizing he had walked completely blind into a meticulously laid trap. Merrick was no longer fighting for a piece of property. He had just submitted highly questionable documents to a sitting judge, and his own professional license was suddenly hovering over the fire. My father wiped a thick layer of sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. My mother sat entirely rigid, staring blankly at the polished wood of the desk, her carefully constructed narrative unraveling by the second. I did not gloat. I simply used the 10 minutes to organize the final sequence of my documents. I arranged the medical transport log right next to the notary verification page, placing both of them directly above the motion-activated security camera data. I was aligning the crosshairs, preparing for the exact moment the legal pressure needed to peak, exactly 10 minutes later. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Boone took his seat at the bench. He did not offer a polite preamble. He immediately zeroed in on the exact vulnerability my parents had desperately tried to hide. "We will now address the commercial assets," Boone announced, his voice carrying a dangerous, low resonance. "Mr. Merrick, I direct your attention to the preliminary deposit contract executed with a corporate entity known as Pine Meridian Logistics Limited Liability Company. This contract explicitly outlines the sale of the commercial warehouse property located on the Eastern County line." Merrick stood up slowly, looking physically ill. "Yes, Your Honor." Boone stared directly over Merrick's head, locking his gaze onto my father. "The signature on the final page of this commercial contract does not belong to Evelyn May Campbell. It belongs to Ronald Campbell, signing under the supposed authority of a durable power of attorney. I am profoundly concerned by the timeline here. This contract was executed 6 months prior to the passing of the property owner." Ronald scrambled to his feet, his heavy wooden chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "Your Honor, that was just a preliminary discussion. It was just an idea. We were exploring options to cover her mounting medical bills and the taxes. There was nothing certain about it. We were simply planning for the absolute worst-case scenario." "Nothing certain," Boone challenged, adjusting his glasses with a sharp, aggressive motion. "Mr. Campbell, this contract includes a physical cash deposit of $25,000 wired directly into a holding company that you personally control. Furthermore, it contains a strict penalty clause stating that if the property is not fully transferred within 90 days of the owner's death, the deposit must be returned with an additional 10% penalty fee. You were not exploring options. You were actively negotiating the sale of land you did not legally own." The gallery behind me let out a collective, audible gasp. I stood up from my table. "Your Honor, I have one additional piece of correspondence to submit to the clerk regarding this specific transaction." I handed a single printed sheet of paper to the bailiff, who walked it up to the bench. "This is an email thread dated 2 weeks before the deposit contract was signed," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly clinical. "It was subpoenaed directly from the commercial real estate broker representing Pine Meridian Logistics." Judge Boone took the paper, his eyes scanning the highlighted text. He read it aloud for the entire room to hear. The email from Ronald Campbell states, and I quote, "Do not worry about the current title. I am the soon-to-be owner. Once the final paperwork is finalized this week, we can proceed with the deposit." End quote. Boone dropped the paper onto his desk with a heavy slap. He leaned forward, the full, crushing weight of his judicial authority bearing down on the plaintiff table. This court is no longer looking at a simple dispute over a family will. We have rapidly crossed into the territory of severe misrepresentation, fraudulent inducement, and bad faith filing. Denise Campbell leaped out of her chair. The clinical, undeniable destruction of her reputation was too much for her to bear. She abandoned the legal strategy completely and reverted to her only remaining weapon. "You have to understand us!" she cried out, her voice echoing wildly off the high ceilings. "She was losing her mind. She was hoarding her assets and leaving us to drown in debt while we did all the dirty work. We did everything for her. We were just trying to protect our own family from financial ruin." Boone did not soften his expression for a fraction of a second. "Mrs. Campbell, sit down immediately. I am no longer interested in your moral justifications or your family grievances. This court is currently concerned exclusively with forged signatures, manipulated dates, diverted cash flow, and the severe contradictions in your sworn testimony today." Denise collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands, realizing that tears held absolutely zero currency in a room governed by paper trails. The courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The trap was fully sprung, but there was one final string left to tie. I remained standing, looking up at the bench. "Your Honor, if I may briefly address the court regarding the nature of the financial support I provided to the deceased," I asked quietly. Boone nodded, his expression softening just a fraction. Go ahead, Miss Campbell. The plaintiffs have repeatedly questioned why my financial support was kept completely secret, I stated. I turned my body slightly, looking not at the judge, but directly at my parents. They want to know why the money was routed through an independent trust, and why my grandmother never told them I was paying for her advanced care. I let the silence hold for 3 long seconds, ensuring every single person in the room was hanging on my next words. Evelyn May Campbell was physically frail, but her mind was terrifyingly sharp until her final day, I said, my voice carrying clear and steady. She demanded that I keep my involvement entirely hidden from them. She explicitly instructed me to document every single penny I sent, every phone call we had, and every legal interaction she engaged in. When I asked her why she insisted on such extreme, exhausting secrecy, she told me the exact reason. I took a slow, deep breath, delivering the final, devastating blow. She said she knew exactly what they would do when she was gone, I concluded. She asked me to keep the records because she was absolutely terrified that someone in this room would try to twist the truth, forge the documents, and turn the truth inside out the moment she could no longer speak for herself. The courtroom was so completely devoid of sound that I could hear the low, mechanical hum of the air conditioning vents struggling against the Tennessee humidity. I did not return to my seat. I stood in the open space between the tables, commanding the center of the room. The moment of emotional confrontation had passed. It was time to execute the final, mathematical dismantling of their entire scheme. I was no longer speaking to my parents. I was speaking directly to the law. Your Honor, I began, my voice perfectly measured. This civil petition was never truly about who rightfully inherits a sagging white house on Elm Street. It is entirely about who used a dying, vulnerable woman to prepare a lucrative commercial transaction behind her back and who fabricated a legal crisis to cover their tracks. I gestured toward the heavy gray binder resting on the judge's desk. I direct the court's attention to the timeline established in Exhibit 18. Let me walk you through the final 12 months of my grandmother's life. I have cross-referenced the appearance of the forged power of attorney, the systematic cash withdrawals from her checking account, the dates of my parents' physical visits to the property, and the exact phase when the commercial real estate broker first contacted the logistics developer. Judge Boone opened the binder, his eyes scanning the dense, color-coded spreadsheets I had prepared. You will see a highly specific, undeniable pattern. I continued, pacing slowly. The cash bleed began exactly 10 months ago. But the pivotal moment occurred in the fall. I asked the court to look closely at the completed durable power of attorney the plaintiffs submitted as the foundational evidence for their authority. The date of the notary stamp and the required witness signatures is listed as the 14th of October. I paused, letting the specific date hang in the air for a long moment. Todd Merrick closed his eyes, his hands gripping the edges of his table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He knew the drop was coming. Now, please turn to Exhibit 19, which contains the certified medical logs from the county pulmonary clinic, I said, on that exact date. The 14th of October. Evelyn May Campbell was admitted to their critical observation ward following a severe respiratory event. Her check-in time is documented at 9 in the morning. She was heavily medicated with intravenous treatments and did not discharge until 6 in the evening. She was physically incapable of sitting in a downtown legal office to sign away her financial independence. She was incapacitated in a hospital bed 3 towns over. A low, collective murmur of disgust rippled through the gallery behind me. The residents of Ashbriar were finally seeing the sheer, predatory calculation behind the grieving parent routine. Furthermore, I added, refusing to let the momentum slow. The court possesses a supplemental flash drive labeled as Exhibit 20. It contains motion-activated security footage provided by a neighboring property owner. It clearly shows my parents arriving at the Elm Street house the night before the purported notarization. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, they are recorded carrying thick leather portfolios inside the house. I submit to the court that the document was not signed in the presence of a legally appointed notary. It was prepared outside the declared setting, and the signature was coerced or entirely manufactured while the property owner was alone in her living room. Judge Boone did not ask me to clarify. He reached beneath his heavy desk and pulled out a single sheet of paper with the state seal embossed at the top. The court took the liberty of verifying the credentials attached to this document during the recess, Boone announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority. The state licensing board confirms that the notary seal applied to this power of attorney belongs to a commission that formally expired 2 full years before this signature was allegedly witnessed. The stamp used was legally invalid long before it touched this paper. Merrick scrambled out of his chair, desperate to save whatever microscopic shred of his career was left. He was sweating profusely, the expensive fabric of his suit clinging to his shoulders. "Your Honor," Merrick stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "My clients are not legal professionals. They were operating under immense, crushing stress regarding their mother's failing health. They may have simply confused the preliminary drafts of the paperwork, or misunderstood the stringent requirements of the notary process during a medical crisis. It was a chaotic environment. It is entirely possible this was an administrative oversight, not a malicious fabrication." Boone stared at the lawyer with a look of pure, unadulterated judicial contempt. "You do not use confused paperwork to solicit a commercial buyer. Mr. Merrick, you do not accidentally attach an expired, forged document to a civil lawsuit to seize control of an estate. They used this specific invalid document to bolster their petition against the defendant and to initiate contact with Pine Meridian Logistics. Do not stand in my courtroom and attempt to dress up bad faith fraud as a simple administrative typo." Merrick slowly sank back into his chair, entirely defeated. He folded his hands over his useless legal pad and stared at the floor. I turned back to the judge. "I have one final piece of evidence to present regarding the timeline of this transaction. It is the ultimate answer to why they were in such a desperate rush to invalidate the trust." I directed Boone to the final tab in the gray binder. "When my father signed that preliminary deposit contract with the developers 6 months ago, the corporation wired a deposit of $25,000 to secure the land. The plaintiffs claimed earlier today that they were exploring options to pay for my grandmother's care. However, the financial routing data proves otherwise." I looked directly at my father. He was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes through a forensic account reconciliation. I traced the movement of that deposit. I stated clearly, driving the final nail into the coffin. $8,500 of that corporate money was immediately transferred out of the holding company and directly into a joint personal checking account belonging to Ronald and Denise Campbell. This was the exact same account they used to manage their outstanding high-interest medical debts and personal loans. The memo line on the internal bank transfer does not say elder care or property taxes. It reads, "Consulting Advance." The entire courtroom fell completely silent. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was paralyzing. Everyone in the room finally understood the undeniable truth. My parents had not come to this courthouse demanding fairness or seeking justice for a neglected mother. They had come to legally legitimize a theft they had already committed. They had taken corporate money for land that did not belong to them. Using paperwork they had forged themselves, and then they tried to destroy their own daughter to prevent the truth from coming to light. Judge Boone closed the binder slowly. He folded his hands together on top of the gray cover. He looked down at the plaintiff table, his expression completely devoid of mercy. This court is now looking at a severe, coordinated effort to defraud a vulnerable individual and manipulate the judicial process for personal financial gain, Boone declared, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I will be taking the next several hours to thoroughly review the procedural sanctions available to me. which may include referring this entire matter to the district attorney for criminal investigation regarding the fraudulent conveyance of property. Boone leaned forward, his piercing eyes locking directly onto my father. Before I make my final ruling on the validity of the trust and the immediate dismissal of your petition, Boone said, his tone dropping to a quiet, controlled threat. I'm going to ask you a very direct question, Mr. Campbell. You are still under oath, considering the overwhelming documented evidence that has just been presented to this court. Do you wish to formally amend your previous testimony regarding your actions, your authority, and the origin of these documents? The pressure in the room was absolute. My father's broad shoulders collapsed entirely. The aggressive, domineering man who had screamed at me on the front lawn 9 years ago was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered shadow. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He slowly turned his head, his eyes darting frantically. He looked at Todd Merrick, who refused to meet his gaze. Then, he looked at my mother. Denise was staring back at him, her face completely pale, her lips trembling in silent panic. The united front had violently fractured, the signs of a total. Catastrophic internal collapse were visible to every single person in the room. They had built a house of lies, and I had just handed the judge the match. The crushing weight of Judge Boone's question hung in the stagnant air of the courtroom. My father looked physically hollowed out. He gripped the edge of the heavy wooden plaintiff table, his knuckles bone white. And finally, the dam of his arrogant pride completely broke. "We were drowning," Ronald whispered, his voice cracking, barely loud enough to carry over the low hum of the air vents. The medical bills, the property taxes, the high-interest loans, they were eating us alive. I thought if we could just secure a quick sale on that commercial plot, it would be a clean way out for everyone. We needed a lifeline. He was still dodging the ultimate truth. He danced carefully around the forged signature, refusing to confess directly to the actual crime of manufacturing the document. He was desperately trying to frame his actions as a panicked man's survival tactic rather than a calculated, predatory fraud. Before the judge could press him further, my mother stood up. Her face was streaked with ruined makeup, the mask of the grieving, righteous matriarch completely dissolved into raw panic. "I was terrified of losing everything," Denise cried out, her voice raw and jagged. "I was terrified of being left behind in this town with nothing to show for my entire life. I knew if you came back, Harper, you would just erase us. You would take what she left and wipe us right out of the family history. I could not let you have that kind of power over us." Her confession laid bare the absolute ugly core of their motivation. This was never purely about greed or unpaid medical debts. It was about an obsessive need for control and a profound, paralyzing fear of the daughter they could no longer manipulate. They did not forge those papers just to get rich. They did it to make sure I remained underneath their heel. Judge Boone did not offer them a single ounce of sympathy. He straightened his thick black robe, picked up his pen, and prepared to deliver the final strike. "The psychological motivations behind your actions do not excuse the profound illegality of your methods," Boone stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. Based on the overwhelming, verifiable forensic evidence presented by the defense, I am formally denying the plaintiff's petition in its entirety. This court upholds the final amendments to the living trust. I legally confirm Harper Campbell as the sole beneficiary and the exclusive, rightful successor trustee of the estate of Evelyn May Campbell. My parents slumped in their chairs, the finality of the words washing over them like ice water. But the judge was nowhere near finished. "Furthermore," Boone continued, his eyes narrowing to sharp slits, "I am officially ruling that this civil petition was filed in remarkably bad faith. It was constructed upon a foundation of severe misrepresentation and highly unreliable documentation. Consequently, I am ordering the plaintiffs to pay the full scope of the defense's civil litigation costs and associated legal fees. Todd Merrick closed his eyes, rubbing his temples as the financial ruin of his clients was cemented into the public record. But we are not stopping at civil financial sanctions, Boone declared, delivering the second, far more devastating legal shockwave. I am ordering the court clerk to immediately forward the contested, durable power of attorney, along with the defense's corresponding medical timelines and security footage, directly to the district attorney's office for fraud review. They will conduct a thorough, independent investigation into the origin of that signature. If they conclude what this court strongly suspects, you will be facing severe criminal indictments. Ronald let out a quiet, strangled gasp. The abstract threat of prison had just materialized into a direct, unavoidable judicial mandate. Finally, Boone said, turning his attention to the property itself. I am ordering the immediate removal of any and all LIS pendens notices or legal encumbrances placed upon the estate assets due to this frivolous lawsuit. The commercial warehouse and the residential property are to be completely shielded from any further unauthorized negotiation. You have absolutely no legal right to that land, Mr. Campbell, and you will notify your corporate buyers of that fact before the close of business today. The wooden gavel remained untouched on the desk. Boone did not need it. He looked out over the packed gallery, addressing the whispering townspeople just as much as he was addressing my parents. I want to place one final note on the permanent public record, Boone said, his tone shifting from legal mandate to a cold, moral judgment. The plaintiffs came into this room today and spent a significant amount of time aggressively attacking the character, the work ethic, and the basic human decency of the defendant. They called her useless. They called her selfish. Yet, when faced with an airtight, professionally executed forensic defense, they could not refute a single line of her objective financial evidence. Miss Campbell did not win this case with emotional theatrics. She won it with undeniable truth, extreme competence, and a profound dedication to her grandmother's actual wishes. The judge gave me a single, respectful nod. Court is adjourned, the bailiff shouted for everyone to rise. I stood up, calmly gathering my documents and placing them back into my heavy-duty backpack. The gallery behind me erupted into a chaotic symphony of hushed, frantic conversations. But I tuned it all out. I did not cheer. I did not pump my fist in the air or turn around to gloat at the people who had judged me just hours prior. I simply zipped my bag, pushed my chair in, and walked down the center aisle. The crowds parted for me in absolute silence, their eyes wide with a brand new, highly cautious respect in the weeks that followed. I did exactly what I came to Ashbriar to do. I did not sell the estate to the first corporate bidder. I kept my grandmother's sagging white house, hiring a local crew to fix the roof and repaint the porch. I took control of the rusting commercial warehouse, leveraging my corporate connections to establish a highly profitable, transparent leasing agreement with the new logistics developers. But I did not keep all that newfound revenue strictly for myself. I took a significant percentage of the monthly commercial income and established a permanent emergency home repair fund in Evelyn's name, specifically designed to help the elderly residents of the county fix their heaters and repair their roofs so they would never have to beg their abusive children for survival. But the true resolution of this entire ordeal did not happen in the bank, and it did not happen with the properties. It happened in the exact moment I walked out of the heavy brass doors of the courthouse on that humid afternoon. I stopped at the top of the wide concrete steps, breathing in the fresh air. I heard the door open heavily behind me. Ronald and Denise Campbell stepped out into the daylight. They looked 10 years older, completely shattered by the legal and financial ruin they had brought upon themselves. They stopped a few feet away from me. For the very first time in my entire life, my parents looked at me and actually saw the woman standing in front of them. They did not see a rebellious teenager they could bully into submission. They did not see an easy target they could legally manipulate. They saw an immovable wall of competence and truth that had systematically dismantled their entire world without ever once raising her voice. I did not offer them a goodbye. I just turned and walked down the steps toward my car as I listened to their heavy, defeated footsteps fading into the background. I finally understood the true nature of what had transpired. The deepest, most satisfying revenge was never about watching them collapse under the weight of a criminal investigation, nor was it about taking the money they so desperately craved. The ultimate revenge was simply refusing to play their game. It was letting the meticulous paper trail. The undeniable truth, and my own quiet dignity stand tall and unbreakable in front of every single person who had ever dared to believe I was just a useless daughter. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on this video, and show your support by hitting the notification bell so this story can reach and inspire even more people.